Welcome, viewers. This is Martin Henry from Education International. I'm the research coordinator. As we're all aware, with the coronavirus pandemic happening around the world, we're modeling technical connectivity here, and we have moved from a live webinar to a platform where we're integrating via Zoom. So we will be working our way through the technical specificities, but I'm delighted to introduce our two authors. And we have with us John MacBeath and John Bangs. Now, Professor John MacBeath is Professor Emeritus at Cambridge University. He was Chair of Educational Leadership from 2000 to 2012. He's worked with the Blair government, the Scottish government, the OECD, UNESCO, ILO, European Commission, and I'm sure countless others. So thanks very much for zooming in, John. And we also have John Bangs, who works with us here at EI. He's an artist, a unionist, a teacher, and a Londoner. He spent 20 years teaching in Tower Hamlets and went all the way to the leafy lanes of Greenwich via the head of education at the NUT, which is now the National Education Union. And he's also a senior consultant with us here for the General Secretary at EI, and is the chair of TUAC, which is the Trade Union Advisory Committee at the OECD. So welcome, John. Thanks very much for agreeing to be on this webinar with us. We are going to be discussing these two books, which are Reforming or Reinventing Schools, and in particular, the latest incarnation. Now, the first book, when I read the people who'd been talked to, has a cast of thousands, a rogues gallery, you might say, in education, of people who've been highly influential, who shaped the English education system. And we're looking now 10 years on at an education system which has moved a decade forward, but what has happened in the meantime, and what are the international implications of the policy changes and the moves that have been afoot? So without further ado, we're going to start with John MacBeath, and I'm going to open up by passing over to, in fact, I think it's you, isn't it, John Bangs?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
With the slides, and we're going to have a slideshow, and then we're going to come on to some questions. So, John, over to you.
Yeah, it's J1 and J2 in the trade. Thank you very much, Martin. I think you've done a very good. I work with Cambridge University as well, and I'm an honorary visiting fellow there as well, which is why I've continued my good work professional relationship with J2. Perhaps the first slide, without more ado, as you say. Next. Okay, right. Martin put up one book, which was this, which is Reinventing Schools, Reforming Teaching. And I don't want to spend much time on it because what we're concentrating on is the book that we've currently done, but there is a bit of context worth doing. Back in 2009, the new Labour government knew that it couldn't win the next election, and a whole set of people were in very reflective mood and very, very open. And myself and John and Maurice Galton, the other author of the current book, and the previous author as well with John and me, the 2010 book, interviewed a huge range of people. As Martin said, it was a cast of thousands, it felt like it anyway. And we got to ministers, policymakers, advisors to ministers, and a whole set of other people. And we wanted to know about the education reform process. Now, the Blair education reforms became internationally known, which is why it's of relevance to Education International. And I actually interviewed the person who then became the first Education Secretary for the coalition, the Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition, Michael Gove as well. And that was fascinating in itself. But we did that. And what we found was, no, I won't go into that now. I just want to say a bit about the current book, which is Reforming or Reinventing Schools 2020, because it was a decade on that we considered writing this book. And it's a different book to the first one. John and I and Maurice wanted to actually have a reflection and have a series of essays, in a sense, reflecting on the developments that had taken place since 2010. And I want to pay tribute to John, actually, John MacBeath, because he actually did most of the heavy lifting, both in terms of getting the book going, persuading me and Maurice to actually put our fingers on the laptops, and did the whole thing, actually. I mean, it's an amazing achievement. But I wrote a single chapter for that, and Maurice wrote 3 chapters. We'll go over that in a bit. But it's a different book because it's reflecting and looking over the past 10 years. Next slide. It's just worth reflecting that the Blair Labour reforms produced some major improvements. He made education, the famous phrase, education, a top priority. Additional funding over the life of the Blair governments, not at the beginning, but over the life of the Blair governments, actually was put into education, huge amounts of money, actually. New school buildings were built under the Building Schools for the Future scheme. More teachers and more support staff were introduced into schools. The quality of learning was very, very strong. There was a systemic approach to teacher learning, including the literacy and numeracy strategies. They were controversial, but they were also had in my belief, a big impact. But there are a whole set of downsides as well. One of them was public-private partnerships, which I think now previous Labour politicians who were in government regret, because schools were saddled with huge amounts of debt. The line that somehow there had to be a paradigm shift from listening to teachers to listening to consumers, i.e. parents. It was an extraordinarily unhelpful and unnecessary division between teachers and parents. And it led to, in the first years of the Blair government's naming and shaming of schools. I think I've just lost that slide, actually, but never mind, I can actually continue. I'll try and no, I think we got it up. Good. There's an extraordinary statement, in fact, actually. This is what we really did discover about in the first book. And that was that there's nothing rational about decision-making and policy-making at all. It is about always political considerations. And that quote is not from someone outside government, someone with an axe to grind, if you want to put it like that. It was from the ex-chief inspector of schools who made that point, and when we interviewed him, Mike Tomlinson. And there's one point I actually do that we did pick out of the Blair reforms, and that echoes down the years. And that is that if governments impose reforms, however good they are, and John and I worked on self-evaluation, school self-evaluation for years. That's one example. Another example was the literacy and numeracy strategies, incredibly good quality professional development. And other initiatives as well. If governments impose, then they are curdled, rather like milk. What happens to them is that to teachers, they appear an imposition which they had no buy-in to, no relationship with, no ownership of reform. It led, in a sense, the previous Blair government's interventions on pedagogy and imposed reforms led them to not being embedded within the education system. And I think that's the most important lesson. If you want embedded reform as a government, you work with teachers and you work with parents and you work with partners. Finally, this is a very interesting thing that we did find, that the unions that had affiliated to the Labour Party when we came in and when we were protesting about naming and shaming didn't want to know us because they wanted to maintain their relationship. They'd been out in the cold because they'd been affiliated to the Labour Party in the previous Conservative years, and now they were going to not let teacher unions who weren't affiliated interrupt that relationship. That was a fascinating finding as well, and says something about the relationship between unions and governments if they're affiliated to, as it were, Labour Party or Socialist parties. So those were the findings, and I think I've gone on a little bit too much. I think we need now to see what what the landscape looks like now, and that's really, as I said, John's heavy lifting was about. So over to you, John, and the next slide.
Thanks, Morris. Exhausted with all this heavy lifting.
Yeah, poor old soul.
Well, all these compliments much appreciated, but so much of that, particularly the first book, John, was such a breakthrough. And I know you sometimes lament the fact that it hasn't had wider, huge, universal publicity or acclaim, because it was a fabulous book. And that's what made us want 10 years later to revisit it and see what had actually changed. And so the first slide here, the first chapter in the new book is Plus ça change. And for those of you who don't have the linguistic capability, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, the more it changes, the more it stays the same. And the first chapter of the book starts with the 5 W's plus H, that is the where, the what, the who, the why, the where, the when, and the why of what is the rationale for the way things are at the moment. So in the first chapter, I refer to Dylan Williams, who talks about ritualized guessing. And I have had very recent experience of that. I was in France last week with my granddaughter, and she was very good at all her homework. She was getting it through. She knew all the answers. But when I probed, she didn't really have any kind of underlying depth to what she was talking about, because she works in an environment in a school in Paris where all the homework is about that ritualized filling out, completing forms and so on. And it reminds me, or I was reminded yesterday by an email I had from Ulf Schwenker in Germany, who's just about to publish a book. And he talks about using key questions. And he writes this: a teacher using key questions. These are real inquiries, not questions to which the teacher already knows the answer. Always an open question. The teacher genuinely wants to find out what students think, what they imagine. She's not interested in hearing only the one correct answer. So the Plus ça change says, in all these years since we've published the first book, really, has there been any substantive change in the nature of classroom life? The second chapter goes on what makes a world-class education system. And I use a case study here from Maggie MacDonald, a Canadian who works in a very remote Inuit community in the north of Canada. No way in, no way out, except by seaplane. And when she took over that school, she found that ritualized guessing, if you like, was the least of her problems. Half the time young people weren't there, half the time they were on drugs or drink, and the previous head, after 3 weeks of appointment, had already left. It's an incredible story, and you can look at it online if you just look up Maggie MacDonald. And she got a £1 million prize from the Varty Foundation as the most outstanding school in the world at that time. So do have a look at that, Maggie MacDonald, and what she achieved in an incredibly difficult environment. If you just talk among yourselves for a second, I have just dropped things, and I will now try to resume in a rational manner. So where she put the emphasis was less on what I called, quote, the hard skills, and started with what might be called the soft skills: caring for one another, collaboration, sharing achievement, talking about the nature of learning, talking about the social nature of learning, and moved away from that horrible phrase, if I may say so, which has got such predominance now, instructional leadership. A very American term, but unfortunately it's traveled around the world, and we have in the book and elsewhere constantly contested this as leadership for learning, rather than instructional leadership, which places the emphasis on the teaching rather than the learning. So what makes a world-class education system? The second chapter looks at a whole range of different ways, different radical challenges to the nature of the way we do things around here. And the third chapter, which then is Morris's chapter, and I'm not going to go through all of these and spend a few minutes on every one, but I want to give tribute to Morris, who can't be with us, but who looks in that chapter about what does it mean to be a teacher, and talks about still no pedagogy, taking that from our previous colleague, former colleague, Robin Alexander, who wrote the book Still No Pedagogy, because he laments the fact that in all the teaching and learning and that ritual classroom process, whatever happened to pedagogy. So Morris, I think, has been one of the world leaders in this, in challenging, deeply challenging some of the conventions and rituals and assumptions of the system. I got an email, as I said yesterday, from my German colleague, Ruth Schrenker, and he talks about how in Germany he's trying to lead a movement which is challenging much of what's current in policy, and talks about a restorative approach. And a restorative approach, a focus is on trying not to escalate the problem, trying to avoid blame, taking every incident in classroom life as an opportunity to tease out the complexities of cause and effect, employing questioning that do not threaten but probe deeper into the issues, at which point young people together with the teacher discover that the presenting problem, not with the individual, but with the social context and other factors, which actually have exacerbated the predicament. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about chapter 5 and then move on, but I think it's such a key chapter because over a period of, I think it's now 15 years, Morris Galton and I have revisited this whole issue of special schools. Hello, I think we've got another slide there, which is not the right slide. So in the book, we quote one of the big myths, if you like, one of the big myths of leadership, one of the big myths of systemic change is that you bring in a new head teacher. And this book by Helen Lake and Goddard, whoops, somewhere else.
I can see that, John. Given the time, I think you should just keep going and we'll work the slides around it.
I think we're all right. Yeah,
we're back.
Okay. Just the important thing about this book was that he looked at these different models of leadership, and the book describes in detail how the surgeons, the soldiers, the accountants, the philosophers all had their own approach to school change. And he writes, based on a considerable amount of evidence, that it's the architects, the ones who took time to change the architecture of pedagogy, the architecture of the school. It took 2 or 3, 4 years to begin to show results, by which time the famous surgeons and soldiers and so many accountants had all left their schools and gone elsewhere before the schools began to collapse. So it's a recommendation for an incredibly useful account of school change and the process that can take over years rather than simply a quick fix. So if we move on hastily, it refers to the dark traits of leadership, which means that it's essentially about the personalized power of the head teacher. In British schools, and I say British, not simply English or Welsh or Northern Irish, but in British schools there is this huge amount of latitude given to the head teacher, the school principal. And as that previous research I was quoting suggested, those who move on, they don't empower their staff, they don't leave a legacy. And it is the exceptional head teacher who actually leaves a legacy when they leave their school. And yesterday, again, I was talking to my daughter, who's a head teacher in Glasgow, and she had just come from a conference, which the whole day they'd had groups of head teachers from Scottish schools, disillusioned, demoralized by the nature of change, which had put so much pressure on them, and many of them wanting to leave schools. So the dark side of all of this heroic leadership, if we move on to the next slide, we come back to that tout ça change, a head teacher, which we quote at the beginning of the book, about a head teacher who, when she arrived, she said, "We're going to have no homework, no setting, no detentions, no bells, no packed lunches." And the question is, how could schools possibly survive without all those essential conventions? And how dangerous it could be to confront the expectations of young people who know what a school is, and that's what they expect, and that's the purpose it serves. So I was just reminded of that again by my granddaughter, who is not allowed to question or look at why is this why am I getting this homework, and what purpose does it serve? So of course, abolishing homework is one of the things I have, one of my own little pet principles, I'm afraid. So finally, we move on to the last slide here. That restorative approaches have a quite different focus. Try to look at ways in which, how in a classroom, how in a school, are leaders, teachers, everyone involved, able to de-escalate the problem, never using the idea of blame, rather taking responsibility. Every single incident in the school is usually an opportunity to tease out, to talk about the complexities of cause and effect, holding sessions with staff on dialogic approaches. That is, how do we ask questions? How do we work with young people to genuinely listen to their view and what they're experiencing? And when we do that, we discover the origins of presenting problems as lying not with the individual, but with other social factors. And in some cases, and very often, it is with the teachers who may have exacerbated the predicament. So the deeply engraved need for punishment, I could give you a half an hour treatise on the school I went to in Glasgow many years ago, where that was how we learned or how we didn't learn. And I eventually left school without absolutely any knowledge of, or deeper knowledge of what we've been taught, but somehow managed to get my way into a university in which I suddenly had to start thinking about what lay behind all that presentation and beginning to actually think for myself. Is that the end of there? Is there one more slide? Or no, it is now back to my excellent friend, one who has written the chapter 8 in the book, which is an absolutely seminal chapter because it takes up so many of those themes about teacher voice and, of course, teacher voice and young people's voice.
Thanks, John. I just want to say one or two things from what you said. I think your chapter on leadership is stupendous. It's a wonderful piece of work. And I like the categorization of the various types of teachers. I think we all agreed that we all wanted teachers, whether they were school leaders or whether they were teachers in the classroom, to be architects. I think that's right, John. And it occurred to me, given the paradigm of government-imposed reforms that were in the original book, that the idea of governments imposing on schools and the teaching profession as a whole reforms, and them not being embedded because they were imposed, absolutely applies equally to heroic leaders who impose reforms within schools. They don't get embedded either. and the legacy is not left. So I think the model in your chapter of teachers being architects is a superb one. When I left working for the NUT as head of education, I started working for EI, and one of my roles, as Martin said, is liaising with the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, and over the 10 years, working for EI has enabled me, and it's been an immense privilege to actually look at the kind of common things which apply to all teacher unions and to all education systems and to children and to parents across all countries. And that's one of the wonderful things about EI being a global union federation. And so one of the things that I've picked out from my work with the OECD, the research that EI is able to gather from across the world, is a set of lessons from the last 10 years. And one of the most encouraging lessons, because I think when you look at the development of artificial intelligence and massive online learning platforms, MOOCs, et cetera, the temptation is to say teachers are redundant, we can just actually move down the AI route. All the evidence is actually, particularly from the OECD, is that actually, we have to have a human approach to education. It is about humanity, but also qualified teachers are fundamental to the learning of children and young people, and remain so. And the OECD has found it very hard, and most other researchers over the years have found it very hard to make any automatic links between artificial intelligence, information technology, and children's achievements, and to say that simply because you have information technology in classrooms, there will automatically be better learning. They can't make that link. And actually, when you think about it, why should that link be automatically there? So it's about AI and MOOCs, et cetera, and information technology in the classroom are about supporting the teacher, not replacing them. And that's one of the lessons that we picked up. The other lesson, the next lesson that picked up, is that coherent teacher policy on a system-wide basis is core to a successful education system. And I mentioned earlier that actually the teacher policies in the UK, including the literacy and numeracy strategies, which were, in my view, very, very good and had extraordinary quality to them, didn't remain. The only thing that remained in the education system in the UK from a teacher policy point of view was performance-related pay. And that's actually only applies to primary schools, and is actually universally hated by most classroom teachers. Education reform, as I've said, including teacher policy, is only successful if embedded. Now, you might expect teacher unions to say that. You might expect Education International to say that from the evidence. And people might say, oh, well, that unions would say that. Actually, the people who do say it, and all the research over the last 10 years comes from the OECD. They say it as well. And in fact, actually, Andreas Schleicher went out of his way to reiterate that lesson in his sort of quasi-autobiography that he produced a couple of years back. And reform will only be embedded if teachers agree with it. That's what I just said. Teacher unions are representative of teachers. I know time and again you hear from some governments that somehow they're not, but it is worth remembering that actually in practically every country, teachers volunteer to join teacher unions. And the density, that is the percentage of teachers in a union, is higher than in any other work sector. So it shows that actually teachers value their unions, and that comes over strongly from the research, and that union government relations are always fragile and need constant care, trust and attention. And we did a piece of work actually, which I quote in this chapter, with Nina Basha. And interestingly, by the way, there are very, very few researchers, given the fact that teacher unions are immensely strong in terms of numbers, you know, over 90% of teachers are in their unions, you could count on one hand the number of academic researchers, and I know one of them is actually online at the moment, actually Martin, I think, who actually make their main focus of study teacher unions and their relationship with government, and Nina Basher's another, and that's her conclusion at the bottom there. Next slide. So within that chapter, I have a look at how teacher unions actually relate and the opportunities that have emerged over the last 10 years, how they relate to ministers and governments. And a unique opportunity arose as a result of the Obama administration coming in. And it's worth remembering, incidentally, the original Obama administration took exactly the same line as the Blair government did towards teachers. They did their own very special bit of naming and shaming to a school in New Jersey, which outraged the NEA and the AFT, the unions in America. And they have a strong relationship with the Democratic Party. So strong was that anger that actually naming and shaming had been transferred over to the US, that actually Arne Duncan, who was then the Secretary of Education at the US, agreed with union leaders from the NEA and the AFT that there was a better way. And the better way was the international summits on the teaching profession. And this year, and let's all cross our fingers that it takes place despite coronavirus, we're looking at the 10th annual international summit on the teaching profession. And what's unique about them is that actually they provide unique neutral spaces for ministers and union leaders to sit down on an equal basis to discuss teacher policy. 2 years back, I was asked by Education International to review this, what we'd learned from the international summits. And actually what we did find was that the vast majority of unions who have been involved in the summits and union leaders talking directly to their ministers without the interpolation of officials who want to get in the way, is that actually the negotiating relationship between teacher unions and governments had infinitely improved for the majority of unions there. However, third of unions and governments still only a third of unions and governments had to follow up on joint objectives. So there's a bit of a way to go there, but the joint objectives that they set for teacher policy have been ones which very many unions, including in Sweden, in Denmark, certainly in Canada, for example, have been followed up. Some of the objectives that have been agreed are very powerful in terms of teacher policy. Teacher leadership, for example, the concept that actually there is a theory behind teacher leadership, and that actually there has to be a paradigm shift towards teachers being engaged equally. And John you refer to this in one of in your leadership chapter, John, that there is a developing teacher leadership movement across the world, which focuses on shifting away from having principals dictating from the top, informed by a dictatorial system, to having teachers jointly taking part with the head teacher in the development of pedagogy and school policies. Sweden, for example, spent a lot of time during the summits on developing a national approach to professional development reform. And in fact, they have a council in Sweden focused exactly on the development of the teaching profession in the widest sense. Denmark, actually, in 2014, the international summit there in New Zealand was the site where the teacher unions talked to their minister for the first time, having been locked out by the employers in Denmark over a dispute. And in fact, actually, the minister that sat down with the teacher union leaders said, we can't carry on like this, and constructed an independent commission to have a look at the paying conditions and teacher policy of teachers in Denmark. And Netherlands, for example, set up a national council of teachers as a result of the summit decisions. Right, next slide. the third leg of this chapter is international summits are not the only times that teacher unions talk to governments. It happens day to day on a regular basis. Whether or not it's a productive relationship or not is another matter. But what we did actually in the OECD with the unions who attend the Trade Union Advisory Committee that Martin referred to is survey them. We surveyed them twice. In 2015, we looked at the quality of negotiations and all the unions there responded. And we found that out of about 35 unions, only about 4 were happy with the quality of negotiations and consultations in their country. Ireland, for instance, is most teacher unions in Ireland actually feel that the structures that enable them to actually talk to governments is satisfactory in most senses. But very few other unions actually do have that position. In 2020, we did another survey to put in the OECD's education policy outlook, and that is union successes in negotiation. And Martin and his unit in the research unit organised that particular survey, and it's called Success in Hard Times. And we used that survey in the OECD's education policy outlook to have a look at the conclusions from it. And we found that actually, for some unions, the ISTPs, the international summits, were the trigger for joint negotiations on teacher policy. And as I say, a number of unions, about a third, have really gone down that route. But what we also found, interestingly, was that unions who responded said that they were more successful on pay and conditions than they were on teachers' professional issues. Now, that's counterintuitive, because the story is always, or appears to be in the press, that somehow there's always a battle going on which involves industrial action. For many unions, their relationships with governments have been such that they feel they have made, through negotiation, big changes in pay and conditions. It is, actually, I thought it was an interesting counterintuitive finding. What we also found, however, is that for about 20% of the unions, professional issues were also a top priority as well. But for many governments and unions, that they didn't focus as much on teachers' professional issues. And again, the international summits enable teachers' professional issues to be put on an equal basis in negotiation with pay and conditions. So, in a sense, the ISTPs have been an enabling factor to get teacher policy on the agenda in very many countries. Next slide. I think, you know, having said that, I think what would we want in terms of prioritizing teacher policy for negotiation? Well, in our book, I'm just, right, John, picking up your notes. In our book, we set out a number of proposals, and I'll go through them in a minute. But what is absolutely obvious to me is that if you want a successful education system, you have to understand the nature of pluralism itself. That is that the profession, schools as communities, teachers and parents, and governments will not always agree. In fact, the fundamental nature of the relationship is the fact that there will be as much disagreement as well as agreement. But actually what has to inform that is respect. Respect from governments for teacher unions, and respect from teacher unions for government for negotiation. And pluralism is, the better the pluralistic relationship, the better it is for actually moving forward on constructing education systems that work for everyone. What is absolutely obvious from all the work with the OECD actually and everywhere else is that enduring, accountable public education systems are vital. Privatized systems simply do not work. And as I said before, crucially when it comes to the relationship between what you negotiate with government, if you're a teacher union, equal status for teacher policy issues and paying conditions for both areas. In England, we have a fractured education system. It's It's not a coherent education system at all. Academies are a symptom of that fractured relationship. And the biggest irony of the lot, actually, when I interviewed Michael Gove, who was the Secretary of State who introduced academies on a much bigger scale into the education system in 2010, was that he felt he was the most international Secretary of State that there was. Spent his time trying to court the OECD, etc., etc. But his effects and what he did in schools were completely opposite from his view that somehow we had to learn internationally. And my view, absolutely fundamentally, and that's what I say in the book, is that you will only get education systems that work really, really well if you are outward facing and learn from the world. That doesn't mean to say buy off the peg systems from other countries. That doesn't work. But actually having an iterative relationship between teaching professions in one country with other countries, an iterative relationship between governments, learning from each other and saying, that's interesting, how can we move on, how can we adapt it for ourselves? That iterative relationship, outward facing relationship is fundamental to successful education systems. Next slide. Right, this is the selling point. I did my bit of research, and Routledge and some of the other sites like Amazon and Waterstones are all selling the book at the same price. So you can get hold of it. And as I say, actually there's a bit of a debate, John, about whether the cover was the right thing. And I think it's a very nice cover, actually, but still. Anyway. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Thanks both of you. And fascinating and very broad look at not only the English education system, but around the world. And I have to say that as an old deputy principal at Wainuiomata High in New Zealand, if we hadn't used restorative practices, which John MacBeath referred to, we'd have had no chance of getting any learning done at all. So it's great to see that these methods and ways of working are developing around the world, and people are thinking about them in communal ways. And you've referred to this too, John. I'm going to start with John MacBeath, and I've cut down your questions because of the time available, and you've already answered some of them. So we're going to start with some questions, and as we're talking through these, if you're online and you're listening to the webinar and you've got some questions for us, please send them through the social media platform. Write your question into Facebook, and our esteemed authors will do their best to answer them as they come up. So, John MacBeath, you talk about the 5 W's and an H, which I actually learnt in history at school in good old Blighty. What do you think are the biggest changes about the approach the English education system takes over the intervening years between the two books?
We go back to the plus ça change. It is worrying, actually, that not just between the two books, but the books that I did with Maurice Galton, the 4 books looking at policy, and then the book with the 3 of us, and then this new book, it is very difficult to see any substantive change, any radical change that has actually increased either the effective learning of young people or the effective teaching or leadership. And I think that's the most worrying thing, and I referred to it earlier, referring to my case of even in Scotland, would you believe, how disillusioned so many head teachers and teachers are, because the space, that critical space for discussion and challenge, just has essentially disappeared. So I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic about that, but I suppose on the bright side, the plus side, there are individual schools that have, in David Hargreaves' words, what did David Hargreaves say about the subversive nature of some heads who buck the system, who stick to their principles. And it's a very, very, very difficult thing to do with all the pressures that are coming from inspection, from comparative data, from everything else. It's not a joyful experience unless you are mature enough, confident enough, and have enough support to really challenge what's going on in policy terms.
As you say, John, we can't have heroic models working for us. So in terms of that, points of resistance, ability to resist, and the view is pretty depressing. And given the times we're in, it's not unusual for us to be thinking in this way. But what do you think are the bright spots in the English system, and where is the opportunity? I know in the book that you've just written a new preface for us, that discussion about cooperative learning and what's happened in the way that students learn. Do you just want to take a couple of minutes to highlight some of the areas you think have opened up within the education system?
I think that's one of the things that would keep John and I both, and Boris, still interested, still engaged, still challenging, because when you get the chance, as we did with these books, to go and sit in classrooms and watch some incredibly powerful practice, some people who actually adopted those dialogic principles, and you could see them in action. And I particularly remember one school, although I'm moving out from Great Britain, we were having an OECD conference in Finland, and this teacher said, on my first day of school, I emptied the classroom, I invited young people to come in, and I said, I want you to think about this as a place of learning, not a place of teaching. This is going to be a place where you're going to learn. So how do we create an environment? How do we use furniture? How do we use this place to become a dialogic process? And I think working with some of the Harvard, David Perkins, for example, who is if you haven't read anything or listened to David Perkins, he's one of the most inspiring educationists, and he was working in that school and had helped them to really rethink the nature of the classroom as a learning environment, which is the starting point. Is this a learning environment? Is this where you're going to learn? Or is it just going to be a teaching environment?
Okay, thanks, John. I love the way you talk about system evaluation via PISA and other tests, which can be gravely abused by governments, as we know, but can also be useful, as you rightly point out. How do you think this data can be most responsibly used?
Well, in a number of countries that we've looked at, PISA has, in many cases, had a very detrimental effect because people weren't able to look at the data and engage with the data quizzically and interrogating that data. And in the book that we wrote about 5 years ago, based on 10 very intensive days of interviews with teachers in New Zealand, I think they came closest to being able to interrogate the data and to make the connections between the data and the individual experience and the classroom experience, the individual experience of young people, the individual experience of teachers, and how they could take the data, problematize it. What does this actually mean? And of course, that's in many, many cases, the data is taken as read, as God-given, that's it. So it's how you actually encourage people, teachers and others, and parents too in some cases, to be able to interrogate that data. Okay, and we would also argue that teacher unions need to be in that process.
Oh, no, not engaging and have their hands full of the data so that they can use it to shape the policy.
Absolutely.
I think that you've touched on a number of crucial issues. I just want to give you an opportunity to point to what you think this book can do to change the policy decisions that the English government have made. And I'm going to get you to focus particularly on the English system. How do you think responding to this book would be a possible sort of way forward for the English government to open up its policy?
I have to start with, are you kidding? I was on the government task force for nearly 5 years, and I have kept quite close to policy, as has John. And the most depressing experience of all of that time was Michael Gove. And he brought in 3 of my Cambridge colleagues and as consultants for a period of 2 years to look at the curriculum again with a critical eye and think, how can we reform the curriculum to make it more effective? After all those years, or those couple of years of intensive work, he said, no, sorry, off you go. I think I know better myself. Because what I learned at school was how to name rivers, how to give names to the most famous explorers and all of that. He went right back, he turned the clock back about 30, 40 years. And that's what policymakers do, because they rely on their own school experience or the last person they talk to. And there are very, very few who are actually able to have that knowledge. Estelle Morris was one. She was quite exceptional in really having real depth understanding of the life of teachers, because she'd been one herself. And just one of the most arresting moments I had on that task force, when Blunkett was getting very, very upset about all this negative stuff about teachers. She said, well, David, hold on and listen a minute. I was a teacher myself, and walking across from the staff room to my classroom was a very lonely experience because of so much challenge in an inner city school. And she said, David, you just don't understand that. And of course it's true. Now that's not a very positive response, but I'm not. There will be the exceptional policymaker or government minister who is willing to listen. And if I had a better memory, I would be able to name one of those. John will probably help out here. Maybe
well,
not.
we're actually going to go to John Bangs now, and I think that you've opened up the rogues gallery for us, and I do want to give John an opportunity to come in here, because in your chapter, John, you did talk about the fact that there are education systems, and I think you named New Zealand and Finland amongst them, actually, that are able to use policy and respond to the evidence and the information in a more positive way. Do you just want to talk a little bit about what you think the conditions are, John, that allow this to happen?
Yeah, what I do think is interesting is that the narrative that somehow, and that's been the dominant reformer narrative from, certainly some of the more aggressive governments, some people call it the germ, or the great education reform movement, has been to say, devolve everything down, have public-private partnerships, etc., etc. What is absolutely obvious to me is that governments that do have a systemic approach to education, the successful ones not only have a systemic approach, but they do it in partnership with their teaching professions. That's how they do it, and they do it also in partnership with parents. Now, the classic one is Finland. We went along to the International Summit last year in 2019, and the paradigm relationship, as it were, between the OAJ and which is the Finnish Union and the Finnish government, is one where the expectation is that both the unions and government jointly discuss and take decisions about the development of the teaching education system. I mean, I was amazed at a Teaching and Learning International International Survey board meeting when both the leading official and the official from OAJ jointly presented a very important piece of policy in relation to the TALIS study, and it was an expectation. And there are very few education systems where the expectation, and they do exist, and they're the ones at the top. Singapore's a classic example, actually. They have that relationship as well. Some provinces in Canada have that relationship, certainly the Nordic countries, other Nordic countries. And I'm not saying it's perfect. Nothing is perfect. And we have to go back always to Nina Basher's comment that I referred to, the Ontario academic who did work for us on government-teacher relations, that actually it's always fragile and it always needs working on, and it can always, to use an English colloquial expression, go pear-shaped, the relationship. So, there's nothing set in stone.
I think also, and you've pointed this out in your writing as well, that it's worth mentioning Scotland, which is only over the border from the English education
Indeed,
system.
and I'm glad you reminded me, because one of the most encouraging things was to watch Larry Flanagan, the EIS General Secretary, working with John Sweeney at the last, John Sweeney, the Education Minister in Scotland at the last summit, actually doing exactly what I described for the OHA, jointly putting forward proposals. In fact, so enthusiastic was the Scottish Minister that he wrote in the TES, which I quote actually in the chapter, saying that the one thing he's learnt from the international summits is that actually that you can't have a successful education system without trust being embedded in it.
Yeah, thanks, John. I've got a few more questions for you here. You've got a section entitled "Sometimes You Box and Sometimes You Dance," which I must say, I did enjoy the metaphorical flavour of that particular heading. Can you comment on the delicacy of dealing with ministers and how some countries are able to achieve so much more than others? What is it in that policy mix? And you've talked about some of the things that are working, but what do you think the conditions are that feed it?
Well, I think it's an acceptance of institutional structures. I mean, one of the things that we propose in our book is that actually the structures have to be in place and accepted by both governments and unions, where you do negotiate on a whole, from everything, not just paying conditions, but the how the teaching profession is supported within education policy. And the boxing and dancing phrase actually is very much a Scandinavian phrase. It's developed by the social democracies. And in fact, there was a book produced saying sometimes you box and sometimes you dance. The fact of the matter is that if you're boxing with government, and one thing I've discovered over the years is the idea that somehow politicians have enormous carapaces that protect them, and they don't care about what people think about them, is complete rubbish, actually. Actually, politicians are remarkably sensitive and also remember things. I think that's something that's kind of quite bad in a way. What you have to have in the system is that you will always find objections to what you're doing if you're government. You will always, unions will naturally have views about how the government's operating. But you have to say that the most important thing is, even if you disagree, we will carry on talking. And that seems to me the fundamental relationship of boxing and dancing. Disagreement, but carry on talking.
Okay, thanks, John. We're going to jump to the survey now, Success in Hard Times, because as you point out, there are important places where unions engage and places where I think we experienced a bit of dissonance in the responses. And I want to direct you to curriculum in particular, because curriculum's becoming an extremely hot topic at this time of multinational change. There's a whole lot of things that people are aware of in the world that are causing anxieties. There's a whole lot of ways in which education systems are being asked to respond. And OECD have a lot of work going on this as well you know. And there's a whole lot of ways in which unions are either asked to engage and get involved or not, as we've discovered. And I was actually surprised with that data about the lack of opportunities really for co-construction for teachers and governments in this area. Do you just want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Actually, it was quite interesting, actually, when the survey found that actually unions identified the greatest number of successes and paying conditions, there was one outlier actually in teacher policy, which wasn't as great as paying conditions. It was around about 60% of unions saying that. It was about 40%, but about 40% of unions, which I was kind of slightly taken aback at. I thought, actually, I haven't detected this one. 40% of unions said they'd had successes in terms of negotiation on the curriculum, down to 20% on special needs, on professional development, et cetera, et cetera. And I found that interesting, actually. What I also found interesting is that there's great variation between initiation, implementation, and evaluation. And that really does vary. So you might have a successful initiation, or you might have something and be engaged with government in terms of implementation. but that's not automatically or involved in all three at all. And in fact, it can vary. And in fact, actually, as we all know, great ideas that might be agreed between governments and unions, even if they are, often founder at the implementation stage. And in fact, actually, and the OECD's found this, very few governments evaluate the success or failure of their education reforms and learn from it. Very few indeed.
And those that do probably don't ask the unions about the evaluation strategy.
Exactly.
So I think you make a crucial point there. I'm going to ask you to round off before we go to questions from our listeners around how you think the ISTP, the International Summit for the Teaching Profession, the Trade Union Advisory Committee, and the wider work that Education International does with OECD serve the union renewal agenda. You've talked about Basia. Basia and Stevenson wrote a piece for us recently on union renewal. Yeah. And Tor Sorensen, who's put in a question, who I'm going to go to next, actually, is also interested in this area. And as you point out, union renewal and union researchers are like hen's teeth. So how do we actually work out a way of thinking about what this work is doing in terms of serving that wider renewal agenda?
Well, I think union leaderships across the world always have a delicate balance to maintain, and in fact, actually, as I say, it's always fragile in terms of that. I once the leader of school reforms in the Blair government, Michael Barber, once accused union leaders of being cowardly, which really made me angry, actually, because they wouldn't buy up, etc., not understanding that actually all organisations, whether it's Education International, whether it's unions or anywhere else, are made up of their memberships. That's the most important thing. And so I think the most important thing is to get governments to understand that you won't get embedded reforms, you won't get embedded improvements unless the memberships of unions go along with the leadership in terms of reform. And that may take time, that may take a lot of negotiation, but it's worth it, basically, taking that time and taking government serious. And there will always be setbacks as well. That's the important thing. And I constantly go back to Nina's point, Nina Basher's point, about the fact that it's the process, it's working at it, which is the most important thing, with optimism.
Okay, well, optimism allows me to go to our listeners who've been putting in their messages. We've got one here from Tor Sorensen, who's an academic up the road here in Belgium at the UVL, and he's done a whole thesis about the process of working with OECD and Thales and the EU. And has put together some really interesting thoughts about the way that work happens. And there will be a blog coming up from him soon on our blog page to give another little pitch. And that will be worth reading too, on the release date of Thales. And Tor's question is about teachers communicating and sharing their ideas. He says the European Commission has launched several initiatives over the years targeting teachers, educators, and it appears to have become increasingly active in this respect. A couple of examples are e-twinning and more recently the platform schooleducationgateway.eu as a hub for different resources and tools, including a European toolkit for schools. What kind of potentials and also shortfalls, and I'm going to ask you both to answer this, for system reform and reinvention, do you see in such a European-wide initiative focused on teacher communication, CPLD, which you point out in your chapter, John, is absolutely critical to teachers developing, and as you said about the English system, physical and virtual mobility? Well,
John and I started working together back in the mid-90s on school self-evaluation. We had to find an alternative to what was a hideous inspection system, which was punitive, being introduced in the country. And the NUT, I was head of education then, decided that we needed an alternative. We called on John, who was working at Strathclyde University then, to do it. And what I don't want to do is actually, in a sense, steal John's thunder, because in relation to Europe, John, I actually do think the work you did, John, in relation to Europe and the development of evaluation, school self-evaluation at a European level was one of the most amazing things you've done. Anyway, over to you, John.
Very kind. I think that self-evaluation in European schools stands again as one of the pieces of work of which I would be most proud, working with a whole range of European countries and people like Michael Schratz in Austria, and the Italians, Francesca Brotto, and so on. It was an incredible experience to talk to these people and have seminars with them where they would bring in policymakers. And I had great optimism at that time that that kind of dialogue was really going to move things forward. And it did for a while. And I think, like so many things that people latch onto, and it's a great idea, and we're going to do this, and there's all that unbounded enthusiasm. But it gradually kind of dissipated. The same with the work, John, that we did on Schools Must Speak for Themselves.
Yeah.
It was embraced at that time by a whole range of people, and they thought this is going to be the answer. But then there's always that dissipation, or over time another idea comes along, and this is the new idea, and that's going to replace the other. So I'm always a little bit skeptical of the magic bullet, which we keep.
Yes, absolutely. No,
Okay.
I agree with that. One of the things, however, that does occur to me, and I do think iteration is amazing, really, and it's only just occurred to me, is that actually the concepts of teacher leadership are built very much on the ideas of self-evaluation. You are listening to what teachers, students, parents are actually saying within the school, and then actually you're also saying, well, if you have if you know what you want from your school, then you are able to buy into the development of the school as well, and whether or not it's described as teacher leadership. So what I would say in answer to Tor is that there are these developments. What I find problematic is somehow how we sometimes fail to hang on to our histories, and I think that's right. I think what I've always enjoyed working with John on is he's got this fantastic panoramic historical view, so that the work that was done 20 years ago is simply could be as relevant as work that's being done today. And it's one of the things I think are important about unions, is that unions themselves actually are the keepers of history much more than governments. A new government takes over, the previous government's history is, in the words of an official that I talked to 10 years ago, put in a box in the cellar. And so governments never ever learn from what previous governments do, but unions do. And the great capital that unions have is the historical memory of their members and what they've done. And you will often hear union leaders say, we've been here before.
Okay, now given the time, we're going to finish off with this question from Kai Lowe, and it touches on one of the areas we've both already talked about, and is one dear to our hearts. So I'll pitch it to you, and then we can have some closing remarks. And it's been a fascinating foray into the world of teacher policy, and that relationship between England and the rest of the world is a bridge that you've made very clearly. So what is the research on the value of large-scale international assessments to the everyday teaching and learning conducted in schools? This is an old chestnut for us, John. And do researchers see improvements in learning or merely in performance? So it's a question about performativity and what those large-scale assessments actually give us. And I'm going to start with you, John Bangs, as the chair of the Trade Union Advisory Committee at the OECD.
Well, I think international assessments, there aren't that many of them, actually. You've got PISA, you've got TALIS from the OECD, you've got TIMS, and then you've got PEARLS. Those are the three big international assessments. UNESCO and EI also do their own international surveys as well, but there aren't that many of them, actually. The big one, obviously, is PISA, but Tim's has a very powerful impact as well. Pearl's is much more, the gaps between them is much wider. What is the value? I think the value is in terms of policy, actually. And my view is that what has to happen is that you don't assume that these international assessments are always the property of governments. Never assume that. Always assume that actually, since teachers are involved in terms of the questionnaires, the survey instruments, etc., that they are as much property of teachers and the teaching profession as they are of governments. And their findings should be interrogated by teachers and their unions equally as closely as by governments. And often what you find is, when you've looked at the surveys, is that there's more in it for teacher unions in terms of constructing fair and equitable education systems than there is for governments, who actually, as our chief inspector quote said, there's no rationale in policy making whatsoever. So it's the question of who owns the evidence, and my argument has consistently been teacher unions that are in the pole position to own the evidence.
Okay, John MacBeath, as a Cambridge academic, I'm sure you have a view on data sets.
Well, I'm obviously skeptical, if you like. We always have to treat those data sets, as Catherine Riley, who may be listening online at the moment, once described when we were doing an OECD project, as tin openers. And I think that is a very powerful metaphor rather than simple measures which we accept or not. I was at a conference in Edinburgh, and they were looking at data from John Hattie, and you know that John Hattie is quoted everywhere for his quantitative analysis, his huge database. And I was being a bit of a heretic, because I was saying, you really, as teachers, if you can have the time and the space, you need to really interrogate this data. And there was someone sitting in the back of the room from Australia, and I saw him on his phone immediately to John Hattie in Australia, saying, there's a heretic here who's talking about the data and asking us to question it. And in the workshop afterwards, that guy was again presenting the data, and everybody in that room, every teacher and head teacher in that room was scribbling down the correlations, the minus correlations. You know, the 0.63 in television is a minus 0.04 and so on. And I said, what are you writing down there? What does this mean to you? Have you ever challenged or interrogated that data? I didn't say it in those kind of words, I guess, but that is the problem, that only when you have schools in which the school leadership is able to create the space for people to genuinely look at research data, government data, and begin to really disinter and problematize that. And that's one of the things we did find in New Zealand, that OECD study, that there were schools there that were doing that. And that was terrific to watch that, people asking perhaps very naive questions. The David Perkins, why do you say that? What makes you say that? And that's a very powerful dialogue tool. When he worked with us for 4 years on a big European project, he talked about, constantly came back, why do you say that? And I think that begins to penetrate some of the assumptions are made around data and the use of data.
Yeah. Can I just follow on from John, because I completely agree. I think there's a myth about causation in education, which is, the Hattie data that you referred to. Somehow, all you have to do is write it down and you've got a magic bullet. I completely agree with you on that. And I think the idea of research which is based on correlation, if used properly, is about asking questions. Why are things correlated? Why are these effects? Should we investigate more? Research is at its best when it actually leads you to ask questions, not give you magic bullets. I think that's absolutely right.
And why are they apparently correlated?
Yes, yes, indeed.
Well, John Hattie, as of course you're both aware, does come from New Zealand, and I'll never forget the day that we had a front page headline, class size doesn't matter, as I clambered through the 34 year 13 bodies in my year 13 English class. And I can tell you for a fact, class size does matter, and it ended up in the contract as a result of the work of the PPTA. So I think that we've got to keep in context what happens with information and how we respond to it. And you've both been very deliberate about that. I just want to give you an opportunity for a closing remark. Is there anything you want to wrap up on? Is there any further comments about the book, which is available in all good bookshops? And anything that you would like to say just as a closing point? And we'll start with you, John Bangs.
Goodness me. I think Gramsci's phrase about optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect actually applies to education as it does as much as anyone else. I do think that we are at a situation where, an appalling situation with coronavirus at the moment, but also where there are emergencies of populism which are essentially nationalistic. We can't learn from the rest of the world. And I think teachers and their unions and their associations are in a pole position to maintain not an economic globalism, but a globalism of learning. And I think everything that UNESCO and the UN has to do in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, we have to keep those alive and keep that dialogue going about how we can learn from each other. And I think that's, in a sense, the lesson from the book as well.
Thanks, John. And over to you, John MacBeath.
Well, if there's one thing I've learned that is that most people pronounce my name John MacBeath, and it's actually John Macbeth.
Oh, sorry, John. I'm glad you sorted that one out.
Yeah, just before we end, if anybody listening now knows that I'm of the great Macbeth dynasty.
That's a mixed metaphor.
And at times doth murder sleep.
Yes.
Having chattered on all about that, I've almost now forgotten the question. But I think, in summary, I think one of the big turning points for me was how many 100 years ago that I met John Bangs. And I'm not just trying to be schmoozing here, but I think it started for me a relationship with unions, which was incredibly important. And we shared some wonderful times at NUT meetings, and particularly one famous occasion when somebody stood up at the end of my peroration and then the minister at that time, his peroration, and somebody jumped up and said, "You must stop talking down schools." And I said, is that directed at me? He said, yes. I said, I thought that should be directed at the minister, because I was talking up schools the whole time, and he was the one that was talking down schools. And I thought that was really a seminal moment about the nature of listening. You listen to people whose views you are going to agree with, and then you attribute to them your own views. And Doug McAvoy and John Bangs and myself afterwards, when we got in the car, we just let out one long sigh of despair in a way. How much you could say and how little actually people were willing to listen to or understood. That's a rather pessimistic kind of conclusion, but I think for me the optimism that continues is having to work with classroom teachers and people right at the grassroots who are indefatigable, is that the word, in continuing to do what they know to be right and having the courage to challenge what's wrong in policy.
Yeah.
Well, John Macbeth and John Bangs, Education International would like to thank you very much for the time that you've given us to reflect on the book and to think about the complexities and intricacies of international education systems. And for all of our viewers and everybody engaging with this webinar, we'd like to say stay safe at this time of extreme concern with the coronavirus and with all the activity going on around it. And if your schools are closed, as they have been now here in Belgium, you have an opportunity, with football disappearing off the television screens, to be able to access this webinar and watch the webinar and engage with some educational ideas. So on that cheery note, I'd like to thank you both very much for being part of this technical exchange and for sharing your thoughts and your ideas with us. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.